They found a 2,000-year-old female mummy. Its terrifying secret could rewrite European history. A mummy whose hair and skin are still intact after nearly 2,000 years. A stone box submerged at the bottom of a sacred lake, yet with no body inside. A set of human remains discovered in a tomb that may be connected to some of the most powerful figures of the time of Alexander the Great. And even more astonishingly, among the terracotta army of Qin Shi Huang, researchers have raised a question. Could some of the warriors actually have been non-Chinese? All of these discoveries prove that the ancient world still holds far too many mysteries for us to unravel. Yet the truth remains impossible to... Hello everyone! Welcome to the Ancient History Channel, where we explore mysteries buried in the past, strange archaeological discoveries, and historical stories that sometimes leave even scientists struggling to find answers. Dear friends, thousands of years ago, people built great cities, created mysterious rituals, and left behind countless traces of their existence. But time has a very special way of hiding the truth. It buries tombs beneath the earth, sinks sacrificial offerings to the bottoms of lakes, covers the bodies of the dead with mud, and reduces entire civilizations to fragments of bone. Until one day, everything is suddenly uncovered. And when the final layer of soil is brushed aside, questions that seem to have disappeared along with the ancient people suddenly return. How did the woman in the bog die? Who was buried inside the mysterious tomb from the time of Alexander the Great? Why did a Homo naledi child appear deep inside a cave? And did foreigners really once appear among the army of Qin Shi Huang? But these are only a few of the mysteries we will explore one by one. Join me as we follow the traces left behind by the past, because the deeper we dig into history, the more we realize that some stories have never been fully told. Are you ready to begin today's journey of discovery? If so, let's get started right now. Huldremose, a woman. The 2,000-year-old woman with a terrifying unsolved mystery. You know, the world of archaeology is truly mysterious, especially when it comes to ancient mummies. Some mummies are discovered inside magnificent tombs, surrounded by gold, precious objects, and ancient inscriptions. But other bodies lie silently beneath mud and earth for thousands of years, and when they are finally discovered, they remain remarkably well preserved in ways that are difficult to explain. And along with them come terrifying stories of a completely different kind. One of the most famous cases is the Huldremose woman, who was discovered in a peat bog in Jutland, Denmark in 1879. Through their research, experts determined that the mummy dates back approximately 1,600 to 2,000 years, with an astonishing state of preservation. In the acidic environment of the bog, harsh natural conditions inadvertently became a giant mummification chamber. Her skin, hair, and even traces of brain tissue inside her skull were still preserved. But when researchers examined her more closely, they realized that this woman was unlike most other bog mummies. Usually, bodies discovered in peat bogs have little or no clothing remaining. Yet the Huldremose woman was buried wearing a surprisingly elaborate outfit. She wore a sleeveless sheepskin cape, a short checkered skirt, and a head covering. Beside her body, researchers also found a horn comb and a strap containing 2 pieces of amber. These objects alone raised an important question among the experts. Who was this woman? Amber was not something that just anyone in ancient society could easily possess. The fact that she was buried in carefully prepared clothing along with distinctive personal belongings may suggest that she once held a significant position within her community. In other words, she may not have been an ordinary woman. But the story became much more disturbing when scientists examined her body more closely. One of Huldremose's legs had been broken, but what is particularly important is that the injury had healed before she died. This indicates that she had survived a serious injury and continued living for some time afterward. Analysis of what remained in her digestive system also allowed researchers to determine that her last meal included barley bread, but that was not all. They also discovered that Huldremose's right arm had been severed. This detail made the mystery far more difficult to understand. To this day, researchers still cannot say with certainty whether the arm was severed before or after she died. If it happened before her death, it could very well have been a sign of violence or some form of punishment. But if it happened after her death, the cause could instead have been connected to the treatment of her body or a burial ritual. And it is precisely this unanswered question that keeps the story of the Huldremose woman from ever being fully closed. a woman who lived nearly 2 millennia ago, who wore carefully prepared clothing, who ate barley bread as her final meal, and who once suffered a serious injury and survived it. In the end, she disappeared into a peat bog and left behind a mystery about the circumstances of her own death. Perhaps we will never know exactly what happened to her. But what is truly astonishing is that after thousands of years, Huldremose's body still preserves enough clues to force modern humans to reconsider the life, death, and mysterious rituals of ancient Europeans. Things we have long believed we understood may now have to be rewritten in an entirely different way. The 600-year-old sacrificial coffin at the bottom of Lake Titicaca, but there was no child inside. If bog mummies make us shudder because of what remains of the human body, then the next discovery is frightening in an entirely different way. It contains no body, no skeleton, and no obvious sign of a victim. What lay at the bottom of Lake Titicaca, in the border region between Peru and Bolivia, was a small stone box with an unusual shape that immediately led archaeologists to associate it with a form of Inca sacrifice. As you know, Lake Titicaca is certainly no stranger to archaeology. In the world of the Inca, this region held special religious significance. Numerous ritual artifacts have been discovered beneath the lake, suggesting that the area was once used for important religious activities. So when researchers discovered a rectangular object lying within the sediment on the lake bed, they immediately took notice. The box was called Qin and dates back approximately 600 years. It differed from many other stone boxes found in the region because its shape closely resembled that of a miniature coffin. What makes this particularly significant is that the Inca practiced sacrificial rituals in which children were sometimes chosen as sacrificial offerings. Yet when archaeologists opened the box, what they found was completely different from what they had expected. There were no remains of a child inside. Instead, there were objects crafted to symbolically represent beings that may once have been sacrificed. Among the most notable items was a gold bracelet made to fit a very small child, along with a camelid figurine crafted from seashell. The camelid detail is particularly important. In Inca rituals, members of the South American camelid family, such as llamas, played an important role and could be sacrificed alongside humans in certain ceremonies. So why did the Inca place these objects inside a stone box instead of a real body? This is precisely what makes the Qin discovery so fascinating. Researchers believe that these substitute objects may reflect a symbolic ritual practice. Instead of placing an actual child and animal into the ceremony, the Inca may have used objects to represent them. This practice is reminiscent of the use of symbolic substitutes in rituals found in many other cultures around the world. And Qin was not the only artifact providing evidence of this practice. Archaeologists and other diving teams had previously discovered 28 stone boxes at the bottom of Lake Titicaca. Some were cylindrical, while others had polygonal shapes. But Qin stood out because of its rectangular design resembling a coffin. The boxes discovered earlier had not provided enough evidence for scientists to determine exactly what they were used for. Now, Qin has provided another important piece of the puzzle. The Inca carried out sacrificial rituals during times they considered especially serious, such as following the death of an emperor, natural disasters, floods, or famine. Children were sometimes chosen because they were considered pure lives. Some rituals also took place in extremely remote locations, including high-altitude regions and volcanoes in what is now Argentina. The children may have had to travel an extremely long distance before the ritual was completed. But Lake Titicaca held a particularly special place in the spiritual world of the Inca. To them, the lake was not simply a vast body of water. It could be regarded as a sacred place connected to their origins and their gods. And perhaps that is precisely why the small stone box that lay at the bottom of the lake for hundreds of years is more than just an archaeological artifact. It is evidence that within a civilization that built astonishing cities and road systems, religious beliefs could still lead people to perform rituals that are difficult for us to imagine today. However, the most remarkable detail is this. This time, the child was not inside the coffin. Perhaps that is a sign that the ritual was performed using a substitute. And it is precisely this absence that continues to make archaeologists ask questions. What were the other boxes at the bottom of Lake Titicaca really used for? And how many secrets are still buried beneath the mud of this sacred lake? So what do you think the answer might be? Let us know in the comments below, and let's discuss it together. 25 skeletons and the traces of specialized women in a mass grave in Peru. Along the arid coast of Peru, the secrets of a civilization that once flourished continue to be pulled from the ground. And this time, archaeologists did not discover gold, precious treasures, or a magnificent temple. Instead, they uncovered a mass grave containing approximately 25 skeletons, most of them women, along with a few children. However, what makes this discovery remarkable is not simply the skeletons themselves, but also what was placed beside them: needles, pins, and numerous tools associated with textile production. The discovery was made in the Trujillo, Peru area, near land that once belonged to the heartland of the Chimu Empire. This was one of the largest civilizations in South America before the Inca expanded their power into the region. And simply by examining the objects buried with the dead, archaeologists gained an important clue suggesting that these women may have been professional textile workers. According to researchers, most of the skeletons were placed in a seated position with their legs bent, and many of the individuals died relatively young, with most being under 30 years old. This makes the grave particularly unusual because the people buried there appear to have shared something in common, perhaps their occupation or social role. Archaeologist Jorge Menezes Bartra, who led the research project, once pointed out that this group was particularly significant when considered in the context of the period, when the average human lifespan was only around 40 years. The skeletons were also wrapped in a layer of cotton fabric, which was then covered with another layer of cloth made from plant-based material. In other words, the dead were not simply placed in the ground. They had been carefully prepared and wrapped. So, how did these people die? To this day, the answer remains unclear. This is especially significant because Chan, the center of Chimu power, was well known for its religious ceremonies, including human sacrifice. This ancient city was once the capital of the Chimu Empire and is considered the largest city in the pre-Columbian Americas. The name Chan is often understood as having a meaning associated with shining sun in the Chimu language. The Chimu Empire reached its height in the 15th century before being conquered by the Inca around 1470. Because of this historical context, when a grave containing numerous women and children was discovered, the hypothesis of human sacrifice was raised almost immediately. But so far, there is no conclusive evidence that these people were sacrificial victims. And this is where archaeology differs from the mysterious stories we see in movies. Simply finding many skeletons in the same location does not automatically mean that they were killed as part of a ritual. In fact, the evidence within the grave itself suggests a much more complicated story. Researchers discovered one skeleton that remained in anatomical position, meaning the body appears to have been placed in the grave and buried shortly after the person died. Meanwhile, another skeleton was found in a much more disturbed position. This difference may indicate that the people in the grave were not necessarily buried at the same time. Some may have been placed in the grave shortly after death, while others may have been buried at a different time. The grave measured approximately 33 feet in length and width and was sealed with mud. Around the grave, researchers also found numerous fragments that may have served as markers indicating the burial area. Even more remarkably, dozens of ceramic artifacts were discovered in the surrounding area. These objects may reflect the status of the people buried there. If these women truly were professional textile workers, their remains provide us with a very different perspective on Chimu society. Textile production was not simply a form of manual labor. In ancient Andean civilizations, textiles could have enormous economic, social, and ritual value. Therefore, the needles, pins, and weaving tools found beside the skeletons may be the final traces of the work these women devoted their lives to. A grave that initially seemed to contain nothing more than the remains of the dead ultimately allowed archaeologists to glimpse a part of the lives of the living. And perhaps the greatest mystery remains unanswered. What caused the deaths of these 25 people? Why were they buried together? And what role did they truly hold in Chimu society? Until those questions can be answered, the mass grave in Peru will continue to preserve an incomplete story about the women who once lived, worked, and transformed ordinary strands of fiber into an important part of a Chimu civilization. Leti's skull, the ghost species that once lived alongside us. Some archaeological discoveries do more than help us understand the past. They force humanity to take another look at our own origins. One of them is Leti's skull, belonging to a child of the ancient human species Homo naledi. These tiny bone fragments were discovered deep inside the Rising Star Cave system, near Johannesburg, South Africa. After years of research, scientists were able to reconstruct the skull of an individual who was only about 4 to 6 years old. What makes this remarkable is that Homo naledi was not a species that disappeared millions of years ago. Studies indicate that this ancient human species appeared approximately 335,000 years ago and may have survived on Earth until around 236,000 years ago. This means that for a very long period of time, they may have lived during an era relatively close to the ancestors of Homo sapiens. And that is precisely what makes this story so extraordinary. Homo naledi had a body with a remarkably strange combination of characteristics. Some parts, such as the hands, wrists, and feet, shared many similarities with modern humans, while the skull revealed a brain that was much smaller. The upper body also retained many primitive characteristics resembling those of ancient apes and other early human relatives. Put simply, if you looked at certain parts of their body, you might think you were looking at a creature that was quite human-like. But when you looked at the skull, the story became completely different. And that is why Homo naledi was once described as a ghost species. Not because they were actually ghosts, but because for many years, scientists had only scattered pieces of bone with which to reconstruct an image of what they were like. More than 1,500 fossil fragments belonging to approximately 15 individuals had been discovered throughout the Rising Star Cave system. Yet the information available was still not enough to fully understand the face and structure of the skull of this species. That changed when Ledi's skull was reconstructed. Researchers from the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa pieced together the fragments that had been discovered, including 6 teeth, to create the remarkably rare, nearly complete skull of a young Homo naledi individual. But what puzzled experts was not just the skull itself, it was where it was found. Ledi's bone fragments were located deep within the Rising Star Cave system in an extremely difficult-to-reach area. Professor Lee Berger and his colleagues paid particular attention to one question: how could a child with a human-like body, yet belonging to a different ancient species, have made its way so deep into the cave system? The question became even more difficult to answer when researchers noticed that the recovered remains consisted primarily of skull fragments, while the rest of the body was not fully represented. So what happened? Was this simply the result of natural processes occurring over hundreds of thousands of years? Or could the presence of human remains deep inside the cave be connected to a particular behavior of Homo naledi? This is where the story becomes truly fascinating. Some researchers have proposed the hypothesis that Homo naledi may have deliberately placed their dead in deep areas of the cave. However, this remains a matter of debate and cannot be considered a confirmed conclusion. So far, there is also no convincing evidence that Homo naledi ever encountered, interbred with, or directly lived alongside Homo sapiens. What we do know for certain is that this species existed during a very important period in human evolutionary history. While Homo sapiens was gradually emerging and developing in different parts of Africa, a relative with a smaller brain but an astonishing range of physical adaptations was also living somewhere on the same planet. Homo naledi had legs suited for walking on 2 feet, hands with many human-like characteristics, and yet they may also have been much better climbers than we are. This unusual combination of modern and primitive traits makes them one of the most mysterious branches of the human evolutionary tree. And then, sometime more than 200,000 years ago, Homo naledi disappeared. No one knows exactly why. There is no historical record documenting their existence. No cities, written language, or empires remain to tell their story. Only fragments of bone remain, hidden deep in the darkness of the Rising Star Cave system. But thanks to Ledi's tiny skull, this ghost species finally has a clearer face. A child who died hundreds of thousands of years ago is now helping modern humans answer a much bigger question. How many different kinds of humans once lived on this planet, and are we truly the only surviving branch of that evolutionary story? What an incredible discovery, don't you think? Centuries-old tomb reveals secrets about a Ming Dynasty prince in China. You know, not every royal tomb remains intact after hundreds of years. Some royal mausoleums were once visited by grave robbers, their treasures stolen, their coffins damaged, and what remained was nothing more than fragments of a glorious past. Yet even after being disturbed, a royal tomb belonging to the Ming Dynasty in Shanxi Province, China, has continued to reveal remarkable stories about the life of a prince who once held significant power. This was the tomb of Zhu Gong, Prince of Qin, who lived from 1358 to 1398. He was the third son of Zhu Yuanzhang, the founder and first emperor of the Ming Dynasty in China. The burial complex was studied by Chinese archaeologists in what is now Taiyuan, Shanxi Province, China. The tombs were first discovered in 2019 after experts found inscriptions that helped confirm that the site was connected to the royal family. And the deeper they excavated, the more they realized that this was not simply an ordinary tomb. As mentioned earlier, this was the final resting place of Zhu Gong, Prince of Qin, his wife, the Princess of Qin, and two other secondary wives. During subsequent excavations, archaeologists discovered numerous valuable artifacts, including jade objects, jewelry, silk clothing, ceramics, and lacquered wooden coffins. Simply looking at these objects is enough to reveal the status of the people buried there. But what is fascinating is that these artifacts were valuable for more than their material worth. They also serve almost like a photograph of the lifestyle of the Ming royal family. From the silk materials and the decoration of household objects to the style of the coffins and burial goods, everything provides researchers with additional insight into how members of the royal family prepared for death during that period. However, the tomb still held another secret. Experts noticed that the structure did not have a front chamber, unlike some other royal tombs. According to archaeologist Zhao Hui, this unusual feature may reflect a change in Prince Jin's political status at the time of his death. And to understand that, we need to return to the history of Zhu Gong himself. In 1370, during the reign of the Hongwu Emperor, Zhu Gong was granted the title of Prince of Qin and was given control over a fiefdom centered in what is now Taiyuan, Shanxi. He became the first member of the Ming imperial family to hold the title of Prince of Qin, but his fate was not directly connected to some of the most famous power struggles of the dynasty. In 1398, Zhu Yuanzhang died, and his grandson, Zhu Yunwen, succeeded him and became the Zhongwen Emperor. Just 1 year later, a major upheaval took place. Zhu Di, the fourth son of Zhu Yuanzhang, launched a rebellion against his nephew. After seizing the throne, he adopted the reign title Yongle and became one of the most famous emperors in Chinese history. Zhu Gang and Zhu Di were both sons of Zhu Yuanzhang and Empress Ma, but while Zhu Di went on to become a figure who profoundly influenced the history of the Ming Dynasty, the story of his brother Zhu Gang gradually faded into the background. Perhaps that is precisely why this tomb holds such special significance. It gives us an opportunity to look into the life of a member of the royal family, not through records of wars or struggles for the throne, but through the objects that were placed beside him when he died. The pieces of jade, silk garments, ceramics, and lacquered coffins may appear to be nothing more than lifeless objects, but in reality, they are telling a story about the power, status, and beliefs of the Ming royal family. 130 skeletons reveal the mysterious disease that caused medieval people to die young. When we talk about ancient graves, we usually think of tombs that intrigue us because of gold and treasures, while others haunt us because of evidence of violence. But perhaps you did not know that at an ancient cemetery at Norton Priory, Cheshire, in northwest England, what shocked scientists was not either of those things. Instead, it was found directly on the skeletons themselves. Many of these skeletons showed unusual bone deformities that doctors today are still trying to understand. It all began when archaeologists excavated the cemetery of Norton Priory, a monastery complex dating from approximately the 12th to the 16th century. It was here that they discovered 130 skeletons. When researchers examined them, they found that approximately 16% of the remains showed significant changes in bone structure, with the degree of abnormality estimated to be as high as 75% compared with normal bone morphology. But what drew the researchers' attention even more was the age at death. Many of the individuals in this group died relatively young, with an average age of around 35. So, what had caused their bodies to change so dramatically? To find the answer, A research team led by Dr. Barry Shaw of the University of Nottingham, England, used modern analytical techniques on samples taken from the ancient remains. And they discovered a particularly important clue known as P62, a protein sequence associated with the formation and abnormal changes of bone tissue. But the story did not end there. One of the skeletons with the most severe deformities also showed evidence of a malignant bone tumor. When specialists analyzed RNA from the tumor, they detected signs of a small RNA molecule that had previously been identified in modern medicine. These seemingly disconnected clues eventually led researchers to a disease that may be more familiar than we realize: Paget's disease of bone. This is a disorder that affects the process of bone remodeling and maintenance. In people with the condition, the breakdown of old bone and the formation of new bone can occur abnormally. As a result, newly formed bone may lack a normal structure, causing the bones to become thicker, deformed, and weaker. Today, Paget's disease of bone is most commonly detected in people over the age of 55. But the skeletons from Norton Priory tell a different story. People suffering from similar conditions appear to have been affected at a much younger age. And this is precisely what makes the discovery so significant. If the disease typically appears in older adults today, yet affected younger people within a medieval community, what caused the difference? It could have been the environment in which they lived, their diet, genetic factors, or a combination of several different causes. Scientists still cannot provide a completely certain explanation, but these ancient skeletons offer a rare opportunity. They allow researchers to see the history of a disease through the human body itself. This is particularly significant because England is considered a region with a notable prevalence of Paget's disease of bone in modern times. However, the reasons why the disease is more common in certain regions are still not fully understood. And when scientists return to the skeletons from Norton Priory, they are not simply studying the dead. They are searching for clues that could help explain a disease that still exists today. Just imagine this: a person who lived hundreds of years ago, without modern hospitals, without x-rays, and without genetic testing, may have had to live with a deformed body without ever understanding why. They left behind no diary, no medical records, no testimony from their family. The only thing that remains is their skeleton. But with technologies that medieval people could never have imagined, scientists today are reading every trace preserved within those bones to learn about their lives and their illnesses. And this is precisely what makes archaeology so astonishing. Sometimes, the dead do not simply tell us stories about the past, they also help modern humanity better understand problems that remain unresolved in the present. The skeletons at Norton Priory are therefore far more than the remains of an ancient cemetery. They are a kind of medical record buried beneath the ground, showing us that the diseases we face today may have accompanied humanity for far longer than we ever realized, long before modern medicine came into existence. Terrifying to think about, isn't it? Giant skeleton on an ice floe. A sea monster or an unidentified creature. A photograph taken amid the freezing waters of Newfoundland, Canada, once left researchers scratching their heads. In the image, you can see brown ribs and a massive curved spine protruding from the surface of a white sheet of ice floating in the sea. At first glance, it looks nothing like the skeleton of a gigantic sea creature that had somehow become frozen in the middle of the ocean, right? But that is only what our eyes see. The real question was, what kind of animal did these bones actually belong to? That was the mystery scientists had to investigate. The photograph was taken in the Bonavista Bay area, on the eastern coast of Newfoundland, Canada. The people who took it were a married couple, Eli and Donna Norris, who lived near the town of Newtown. Later, a friend of theirs named Ruth Nee sent the photograph to the Canadian Federal Department of Fisheries and asked experts to verify what it showed. You might be surprised to know that even researchers were caught off guard when they first saw the photograph. Among them was Gary Stenson, a marine mammal specialist with Canada's Department of Fisheries, who admitted that he had never encountered a case quite like it. Naturally, no one could immediately determine the origin of the skeleton. That was why experts began considering several possibilities. They suggested that it could have been a bearded seal, a walrus, or even a beluga whale. Each hypothesis had its own reasoning behind it, but the problem was that what could be seen in the photograph was simply not clear enough to reach a definite conclusion. What is worth noting is that the people who discovered the skeleton did not try to turn the story into a mystery simply to attract attention. The Norris couple did not want to become the focus of the media. However, they were willing to confirm that the photograph was real and that they had genuinely seen the skeleton among the ice. Even Stenson believed that this was not a hoax. According to Mr. and Mrs. Norris, the enormous section of the spine protruded nearly 8 feet above the ice. That size alone was enough to make the mystery even more difficult. If it really was the skeleton of a marine mammal, then the creature must have been quite large. But the shape of the skeleton was not clear enough for researchers to determine exactly what species it belonged to. And then another question emerged. How did the animal die? One possibility was that it had fallen into a crack in the ice or become trapped in an icy area. Another possibility was that the animal had died earlier and its body was gradually covered by ice and snow over time. But there was no direct evidence to confirm any of these theories. The freezing environment also made it more difficult to determine the age of the remains. Without suitable samples to analyze, experts had little way of knowing exactly how long ago the creature had died. There was an even bigger problem. Where was the ice floe carrying the skeleton drifting? This was not a simple matter. Sea ice constantly moves with ocean currents and changing weather conditions. Once the original location was lost, returning to the site to search for and collect samples could have been almost impossible. But Newfoundland has witnessed similar stories more than once. In June 2001, a resident of St. Bernard's in the Fortune Bay area of Newfoundland, Canada, discovered a skeleton approximately 7 meters long, or more than 23 feet, that had washed ashore. Much of the skeleton had already undergone severe decomposition, making it impossible for experts to determine exactly what kind of creature it belonged to. Local residents simply called it a sea monster. And perhaps discoveries like these are what have made the coastline of Newfoundland such a fascinating place for human curiosity. Foreign warriors in Qin Shi Huang's mausoleum. Did the Silk Road begin earlier than we think? For thousands of years, the terracotta army of Qin Shi Huang has continued to astonish the world. Thousands of warriors stand in long rows beneath the ground, each with a different face, posture, and role. But the more archaeologists excavate, the more they have come to recognize something fascinating. This enormous army may not have consisted entirely of warriors bearing the characteristics of ancient Chinese people. Evidence of this emerged during years of research and excavation at Qin Shi Huang's mausoleum in Xi'an, Shanxi Province, China, where the famous terracotta army was buried approximately 2,200 years ago. Scientists once discovered 121 human skeletons in the area. Remarkably, DNA testing conducted on one of the skeletons in 2003 revealed characteristics that researchers at the time described as being associated with Eurasian ancestry. This discovery immediately raised a fascinating possibility. Contact between ancient Chinese populations and groups of people from the West may have occurred much earlier than we usually think. But hold on before concluding that these people were definitely European mercenaries. The evidence currently available is not sufficient to prove that. However, discoveries associated with the terracotta army have made the hypothesis even more intriguing. During archaeological excavations, experts discovered several warrior statues painted in unusual colors. One particular statue attracted attention because of its blue-painted face, along with a black beard and black hair. Looking at these statues, researchers could not help but ask, why did the craftsmen create such distinctive features? Was this simply a form of artistic decoration? Or were these faces actually modeled after different groups of people who once served in the military? So far, the answer remains unclear. But if future evidence proves that these discoveries were connected to foreign groups, it would have enormous significance for our understanding of ancient Chinese history. We are accustomed to imagining ancient China during the Qin period as a world that was almost completely isolated from the outside. Yet archaeological evidence is increasingly suggesting that the ancient world may have been connected much earlier than we previously thought. Consider the sheer scale of this army. Pit 1 is the largest of the 3 main excavation areas, covering approximately 153,500 square feet and containing as many as 6,000 warriors, most of them infantry. Pit 2 covers approximately 64,600 square feet, has an L-shaped layout, and contains several different types of military units. Pit 3 is smaller, positioned on higher ground, and is believed to have been an area for commanders and military officers. Altogether, the entire terracotta army complex is estimated to contain approximately 8,000 warriors, along with around 130 wooden chariots and 670 terracotta horses. This was not simply an army of statues. It was almost a miniature replica of an entire military system. There were infantrymen, cavalrymen, archers, generals, officials, musicians, and even animals. Each group had its own role, and if Qin Shi Huang truly intended to recreate the entire world that served him in the afterlife, then the presence of warriors from different backgrounds would not necessarily be difficult to understand. Discoveries of weapons make the picture even more astonishing. Archaeologists once discovered a crossbow dating back approximately 2,200 years within the mausoleum complex. This weapon demonstrates the impressive level of military technology achieved by the Qin Dynasty. All of this was part of a massive project that Qin Shi Huang began while he was still alive. The first emperor to unify China apparently did not want to control his territory only while he was alive. He also wanted to maintain his power after death. And that is precisely why thousands of terracotta warriors were created. Qin Shi Huang believed that the afterlife still required an army to protect him. But what makes the discovery of these foreign warriors so fascinating is that it raises a much bigger question. If people from distant lands really did appear in Qin Shi Huang's world, how did they reach China? Were they merchants, migrants, prisoners of war, or warriors recruited from lands beyond China? And if interaction between East Asia and populations from the West really took place during the Qin Dynasty, could that mean that transcontinental networks of communication had already begun to develop before the famous Silk Road of the Han Dynasty? However, this is still an area that requires more evidence. We cannot yet say that the terracotta army definitely included European mercenaries, nor can we definitively determine that the statues with unusual facial features were representations of foreigners. But those very questions are what make the excavations in Xi'an so fascinating. Because the deeper we dig into the earth, the more we realize that Qin Shi Huang's mausoleum was not simply a gigantic cemetery. It was a world designed to reflect his entire empire. There was an army, there were weapons, there were commanders, there were officials, there were servants, there were artists and musicians. And if future evidence confirms the presence of people from different origins, we may have to rethink the way we imagine the ancient world. More than 2,000 years ago, while we often imagine ancient civilizations as separate worlds existing in isolation from one another, they may already have been meeting, trading, and traveling much farther than we ever realized. And beneath the ground in Xi'an, among thousands of terracotta faces, there may still be warriors waiting to be uncovered. What if, among them, we discover even more evidence showing that the ancient world was never truly as divided as we once believed? It's certainly possible, isn't it? The mysterious skeleton in the Amphipolis tomb. Who was the real occupant? A skeleton was discovered inside a limestone sarcophagus. At first, that may not sound particularly extraordinary, but the problem is that the sarcophagus was located inside one of the largest monumental tombs ever discovered in Greece. And when archaeologists determined the age of the structure, the story immediately became far more intriguing. It dates back to the 4th century BC, right in the era of Alexander the Great. The discovery took place at the Kasta tomb in Amphipolis, in the Saras region of northern Greece. This was a massive structure built on Kasta Hill, so enormous that from the moment excavation began, experts understood that whoever had been buried inside was certainly not an ordinary person. But if this individual was truly so important, why did their identity disappear from history? That is the question that turned the Amphipolis tomb into a major focus of attention. Greek officials at the time suggested that the discoveries indicated that the tomb could have been the final resting place of a person of exceptionally high status. Before the skeleton was discovered, numerous theories had already been proposed about who the tomb belonged to. Some experts suggested that it might have belonged to Roxana, the wife of Alexander the Great. Another theory proposed that it could have been Olympias, his mother. There was also the possibility that the tomb belonged to one of the powerful generals who served under Alexander. But then one particular name entered the discussion: Hephaestion. Hephaestion was a Macedonian nobleman and general, as well as one of Alexander the Great's closest companions. The two were believed to have known each other since childhood and to have studied under the teachings of Aristotle. Their relationship was so close that numerous ancient sources and later historians have debated whether Hephaestion was simply Alexander's closest friend or perhaps also his lover. Hephaestion died in 324 BC at Ecbatana, in what is now Hamadan, Iran. His death is believed to have been a devastating blow to Alexander. According to ancient accounts, Alexander expressed overwhelming grief. He cut his hair, fasted for several days, and even ordered the execution of the physician who had treated Hephaestion. Afterward, an enormous and extraordinarily expensive funeral pyre was prepared to cremate the body of his close companion. So, could the skeleton found at Amphipolis have belonged to Hephaestion? This is where everything becomes complicated. One of the most important issues is the method of burial. Archaeologist Dorothy King, who participated in the research, noted that being buried with an intact body rather than being cremated was relatively unusual in the context of ancient Macedonia. That makes the identity of the person inside the tomb even more intriguing. But there is more. Archaeologists also discovered the remains of a wooden coffin, along with numerous iron nails, copper elements, bone fragments, and broken glass. Particularly significant is the fact that several parts of the skeleton were found both inside and outside the limestone sarcophagus. This evidence may indicate that the tomb was entered or disturbed after the individual had been buried. And if that is what happened, determining the identity of the occupant becomes even more difficult. A tomb that had been opened or disturbed could have altered the original position of the body and the burial goods. Objects that were once placed beside the deceased may have been removed or displaced. There is even a more daring theory suggesting that this could have been the tomb of Alexander the Great himself. Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BC at the age of only about 32. According to historical tradition, his body was later taken to Egypt and eventually buried in Alexandria, the city he himself founded. Yet to this day, the tomb of Alexander the Great has never been definitively identified. That gap in our knowledge is precisely why every archaeological discovery connected to his era immediately attracts so much attention. However, it is important to make one thing clear. There is no conclusive evidence that the skeleton at Amphipolis belonged to Alexander the Great or Hephaestion. These theories are based primarily on the enormous scale of the tomb, its age, and the exceptionally high status of the person who was buried there. But even the possibility that some powerful individual was placed inside such a monumental structure tells us something important. Amphipolis was not an ordinary tomb. It is a surviving trace of an era when Macedonia stood at the center of the ancient world, when Alexander the Great led his armies across thousands of miles and built an empire stretching from Greece all the way into Asia. Dear friends, we've just journeyed together through a series of fascinating archaeological discoveries, from thousands of years-old mummies and mysterious tombs to the massive terracotta army of Qin Shi Huang. Each discovery has not only helped us better understand the people of the ancient world, but also reminded us that history still contains countless unanswered questions. And who knows? Beneath the ground, there may still be secrets waiting to be uncovered. Secrets that could force us to rewrite what we once believed to be the truth. So, what about you? Which of these discoveries impressed you the most? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like these, don't forget to subscribe to the Ancient History channel and join us on our next journey of discovery. For now, goodbye, and I'll see you again soon.